Hello. So in this video we're going to talk about Beowulf, which is one of the most important pieces of Old English literature. And I'm specifically working from the Seamus Heaney translation, but there are any number of good translations out there. Now, when I say this is Old English, I don't mean like Shakespearean English, which in sort of casual conversations people often refer to as Old English. No, I mean the actual language Old English, which bears some similarities to contemporary English but is very, very, very different. So to give you a bit of a sense of this, I actually want to read the opening portion of this epic, both giving you Heaney's translation and giving you the original Old English, because that's one of the nice things actually about this edition, is it's bilingual. So the poem starts: "So the Spear Danes in days gone by, and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns. There was Shield Sheafson, scourge of many tribes, a wrecker of mead benches, rampaging among foes. This terror of the hall troops had come far. A foundling to start with, he would flourish later on, as his powers waxed and his worth was proved. In the end, each clan on the outlying coasts beyond the whale road had to yield to him and begin to pay tribute. That was one good king." So before I read the Old English for you, I want to point out this term that Heaney translates as whale road. This is what's called a keening, which is a compound noun that stands in for a different noun. So in this case, whale road stands in for the ocean or the sea. And so a keening is a poetic technique that the Old English, or that the Anglo-Saxons, Old English poets really liked using. We get them throughout Beowulf. So that's something worth noting just stylistically about the poem. So now I'm going to give you the Old English. Bear with me on this because I haven't really read Old English in the sense of read it aloud. I can't read it and sort of understand it, but I can read it and pronounce it reasonably well. But I haven't done this in years, so bear with me on this. Wet we Jardena in Jerdaium Theod Kininge Thrim Jefrunen Hu tha Ethlingus ele Fremadon Oft shield chafing Seathena Threatum Moniaim Maithium Meoda Settle Oftea Exode Eolde Sethen Erest Werth. Sorry, Frank's getting in the way. Sethen Erest Werth Verskräft Funden Hethes Frofre Jebade Weox under Wulknum Weorth Minden Tha Othet him Ehwelke Thar Jim Sitendre Offer Gronrede Hiran Skulde Gomban Gilde Fet Wes God Keening. So that was not the smoothest reading of Old English that you're likely ever to hear, but one of the things that I did kind of do, and this actually also, this made it easier for myself as well as approximated maybe some of the rhythm of an Old English bard, an Anglo-Saxon bard, is I left pauses at what are called the caesuras in the text. So I'll hold this up. So within each line of poetry in Old English, you have a gap in the middle, or at least in Beowulf, not necessarily in all Old English poetry, but you have a caesura, which is a gap within the line, and this was another stylistic element of Old English poetry. So As you could get a sense, though, from that reading, this is very clearly a different language than contemporary English. I think only about 40% of contemporary English words being derived from Anglo-Saxon, but we do have some similarities. So we take a line like "Thewes god kuning," which Haney is translated as "that was one good king." We can see the similarities in the sounds there. Thet for that, Wes for was, God for good, and kuning for king. So we have a similar set of sounds here, even if the language itself is very, very different. But I want to turn now to Beowulf as a story, or Beowulf as an epic and a hero. So this is a piece of medieval literature, but this is not the sort of chivalric knights of... Frank's just going to walk all through this video, apparently. This is not the chivalric knights of something like Le Morte d'Arthur and the later romances. Actually, I'm wearing my Wicked Chivalrous t-shirt for this video, but this is a different type of medieval literature. Beowulf is first written down, I think, in the 8th century, 9th century, but this is an Anglo-Saxon tale, and the Anglo-Saxons were a North Germanic people who, a few centuries after, or a century, 2 centuries after Beowulf was first written down, their descendants who had stayed in Scandinavia would become the Vikings. So we want to think of Beowulf more in terms of Vikings than in terms of Arthurian romance. And so we get that very clearly here in a number of ways, because the structure of the epic is really built around 3 great combats. So Beowulf has to fight 3 major enemies who threaten either his people or his allies' people. The first that he fights is Grendel, who's a demonic being. And then he fights Grendel's mother, who wants to take revenge after Beowulf defeats Grendel. And then lastly, in his old age, he fights a dragon. So I want to read you the portion about Grendel, because there's a number of interesting things here. So this takes place in not Beowulf's kingdom, but a neighboring kingdom, in a hall called Hrothgar. And Hrothgar is a very sort of prosperous place. The hall, Hrothgar is the name of the king. Heorot is the name of the hall. So Hrothgar is a successful king, prosperous king, but there is Grendel. And so again, this is set in Heorot, and it says, "So times were pleasant for the people there until finally one, a fiend out of hell, began to work his evil in the world. Grendel was the name of this grim demon haunting the marches, marauding around the heath and the desolate fens. He had dwelt for a time in misery among the banished monsters, Cain's clan, whom the Creator had outlawed and condemned as outcasts. For the killing of Abel, the eternal Lord had exacted a price. Cain got no good from committing that murder because the Almighty made him anathema, and out of the curse of his exile there sprang ogres and elves and evil phantoms and the giants too, who strove with God time and again until he gave them their reward. So after nightfall Grendel set out for the lofty house to see how the ring-danes were settling into it after their drink. And there he came upon them, a company of the best, asleep from their feasting, insensible to pain and human sorrow. Suddenly then the god-cursed brute was creating havoc. Greedy and grim, he grabbed 30 men from their resting places and rushed to his lair. Flushed up and inflamed from the raid, blundering back with the butchered corpses. Then as dawn brightened and the day broke, Grendel's powers of destruction were playing. Their wassail was over, they wept to heaven and mourned in their mourning. Their mighty prince, the storied leader, sat stricken and helpless, humiliated by the loss of his guard, bewildered and stunned, staring aghast at the demon's trail. In deep distress, he was numb with grief, but got no respite, for one night later merciless Grendel struck again with more gruesome murders. Malignant by nature, he never showed remorse. It was easy then to meet with a man shifting himself to a safer distance, to bed in the bothies, for who would be blind to the evidence of his eyes, the obviousness of the hall watcher's hate? Whoever escaped kept a weather eye open and moved away. So we've got a lot going on here. I mean, we've got Grendel, we got, again, this lovely, even though it's very violent and graphically brutal, this lovely description of Grendel's raid on Hrothgar. And we've got a lot of interesting stuff going on here. One of them is in this first section that I read to you, from line 99 up through to 105, Grendel is identified as a descendant of Cain from the biblical story of Cain and Abel. Now that's very interesting because when Beowulf was first composed by Anglo-Saxon bards, they likely weren't Christian. And Beowulf himself comes from Sweden in this, and he goes to Denmark, which is where Hrothgar is located. So these people would not be Christian. These people would be followers of Norse mythology. And there's some sort of evidence of that in the poem itself. But we've also got this really strong evidence in places like this, that this is a tale that's written down, as opposed to composed, by Christian scribes. And so the Christian God becomes much more central to this than he likely would have been in the original oral versions. We've also, again, got these great descriptions of battle, which is something that's really central to Anglo-Saxon culture as well as to later Viking cultures and things like this. But there's one more thing I want to just point out very briefly here. We've got this great line, "It was easy then to meet with a man shifting himself to a safer distance." It is two great lines, actually. This is another stylistic technique that the Anglo-Saxons are really keen on, which is ironic understatement. They love understatement, and they use it throughout their works, especially consistently throughout Beowulf, where we get this continual use of understatement to highlight particular points or particular reactions to situations. So, if fighting is one of the main things that Anglo-Saxons do in this poem, feasting is another. And so that's the second thing that I want to talk to you about here. We've got this section where Beowulf has arrived at Heorot. He's boasted, which is another sort of important point here, because Unferth, who's a relative of the king, who's a relative of Hrothgar, Unferth has sort of challenged Beowulf's prowess by bringing up a swimming contest in which Beowulf lost the race. And Beowulf says, well, I did lose that race, but it's only because while we were swimming along neck and neck, we were suddenly attacked by a ton of sea monsters, and the other guy kept swimming, whereas I stopped to kill these hundreds of sea monsters and then swam. I mean, there's a bit of like a pro wrestler kind of promoing going on here, and that's another crucial part of Anglo-Saxon and Viking heroics. But it takes place at this feast, and I think this is a really important bit, because the feast is a communal act. It's a communal place in which warriors come together, in which rewards are given out for courage, things like this. But it's also a place in which we see again that Christian element coming in, because the idea of communal feasting, and particularly of drinking wine together, has undertones of the Eucharist. But here it serves another purpose. We've got both the Christian scribe who's clearly aware of the Eucharist, but we've also got this component of establishing rank and establishing community. So it says, "Then the gray-haired treasure giver," that's Hrothgar, "was glad. Far famed in battle, the prince of bright Danes and keeper of his people counted on Beowulf, on the warrior's steadfastness and his word. So the laughter started, the din got louder, and the crowd was happy. Wealhtheow came in, Hrothgar's queen, observing the courtesies. Adorned in her gold, she graciously saluted the men in the hall, then handed the cup first to Hrothgar, their homeland's guardian, urging him to drink deep and enjoy it because he was dear to them. And he drank it down like the warlord he was, with festive cheer. So the helming woman went on her rounds, queenly and dignified, decked out in rings, offering the goblet to all ranks, trading the household and the assembled troop until it was Beowulf's turn to take it from her hand. With measured words she welcomed the Geat," that's Beowulf's tribe in Sweden, "and thanked God for granting her wish that a deliverer she could believe in would arrive to ease their afflictions. He accepted the cup, a daunting man, dangerous in action and eager for it always." I'm going to leave it off there. But again, we've got this communal aspect of feasting, which in the passing of the wine cup has these echoes of the Christian Eucharist, which again would not be a reflection of the the Scandinavian culture depicted in Beowulf itself, but would be familiar to the scribe who wrote this down. But this also establishes rank, and it establishes the communal connections between Hrothgar, the queen, and Beowulf.